So Apple have launched an M1 version of the iPad Pro, and I can't think for the life of me why they've done this. Welcome back to Mark Ellis Reviews, and thank you as always for subscribing. If you haven't subscribed, the button's just down there. I really enjoyed Apple's spring-loaded event last week. I thought it was great. I thought the production was fantastic as always. I thought the new iMac looks fantastic. AirTags, a bit of a muted release, but actually I think they pitched it really well. There was just one problem with it, and that was the M1 iPad Pro. It was the most boring announcement at that event. Let me explain why. As you'd expect, there were shed loads of rumours about this new iPad Pro leading up to the event, but there was one that stuck out more than any other, and it was this new display technology called Mini LED. Now, the new iPad Pro does have that technology in its screen, but it was buried under all sorts of things. So they were talking about the 1600 nits of peak brightness. No one really knows what a nit is, but it's how bright the screen is. 1,000,000:1 contrast ratio, liquid retina. Buried beneath all that stuff, all these big numbers and things, was mention of the fact that the new iPad Pro has 10,000 mini LEDs behind the screen. But what baffled me about the screen technology in the M1 iPad Pro, if that's what we call it, is the fact that they kept likening it to the Pro Display XDR, which, if you don't know what that is, it's basically a pro-grade monitor for a Mac, and it's used by professional video editors and all that sort of stuff, and it's $6,000, £6,000, and it has a stand, which alone is $1,000. But Apple were kind of comparing the technology in the new iPad Pro to that XDR display. They even said that users could take their XDR workflow from an XDR display to an iPad Pro. I have no idea what an XDR workflow is. If you've got one, let me know in the comments, but my guess is that that is a very, very small audience. But regardless of that, all of this screen tech sounds fantastic until you bear in mind the fact that the existing iPad Pro screen, and the existing iPad screen actually, has been brilliant for a long time. It's okay, it's not OLED, but it has never felt hampered in that way. It's been one of the, in fact it is, I think, the best tablet screen you can get your hands on. So if you were confused by how they were linking the new iPad Pro to the $6,000 Pro XDR display, you might have been as confused as I was, but it does get worse. So the headline feature about the new iPad Pro is that it has an M1 chip in it, and the M1, for the uninitiated, is basically a brand new chip that Apple have developed themselves. And first of all, it went into the MacBook Air, MacBook Pro, Mac Mini, and just recently, the new iMac. And it is superb. The reason it's so good is that it contains everything in one chip. And this isn't a new thing, it's called System on a Chip, or SoC. And it basically means that the CPU, the graphics, the memory, the hard drive space, all of that stuff is on one chip. And that results in two benefits. One of them is the fact that the data that you're kind of putting through your computer doesn't have to go off to separate memory, separate storage. It's all contained in that chip, so it doesn't have to travel as far, so it's much, much quicker. And secondly, it's so power efficient. So if you're using an M1 laptop like the MacBook Pro or the MacBook Air, you get fantastic battery life. If you put that into an iPad, the gains are even bigger because you're going from what was ostensibly a tablet CPU, and you're going to an M1 chip, which is essentially a desktop class CPU. And according to Apple, that makes it 50% faster than the outgoing iPad Pro. And then they did this really weird thing where they compared it to the very first iPad that came out in 2010. And would you believe the M1 iPad Pro is 75 times faster than that first generation iPad? Who'd have thought it? Oh, it gets better as well. If you compare the GPU, so the graphics processing in this new M1 iPad Pro to the very first iPad that came out, it is, hang on, 1,500 times faster. But this illustrates the issue that I have with the new iPad Pro. The iPad has always been light years ahead of the competition. You have to bear in mind that the competition isn't much competition. You've got Samsung tabs, you've got what Amazon provide in terms of their Fire tablet thing. There's not much else. The only other thing you can really compare it to is the Microsoft Surface, which is admittedly a very good laptop slash tablet, but it's a very different machine because it runs Windows, it runs a full operating system, a desktop class operating system. The iPad doesn't. The iPad runs iPadOS, which is basically, let's not beat around the bush, a big version of the one that you get on your iPhone. But the hardware that sits behind the iPad, as I say, for years has just been streets ahead, not just of the competition, but itself. You know, the hardware team at Apple that make the iPad and make the chips and all do all that stuff, you know, they're sprinting 200, 300, 400 miles ahead of the people who are making iPadOS. Now, why that is, who knows? Only Apple knows that. Every WWDC that happens, we've got one coming up fairly soon, we see normally some pretty big improvements to iOS on the iPhone. And iPadOS, the biggest thing they've done really is add trackpad support, which I'll come on to later, but that's it. You know, they've kind of messed around a little bit with adding semi-widgets on the left-hand side. It's still this massive sea of huge icons, you know, the Springboard app launcher. They just haven't done much with it. I know they've added things like support for USB-C devices, external storage, slightly better file management, but it is still, to all intents and purposes, a mobile operating system. Now, hands up, I don't put my iPad through its paces. I never really have. But the reason for that is I don't know how to. I've not done any video editing on it, admittedly. I will at some stage do that. There are rumours that Final Cut Pro will appear on it at some point. I do need a lot of convincing that I can go from using Final Cut Pro on a traditional computer to an iPad, but I will of course give it a go. I think the number of people who are using the iPad to its absolute fullest, it's people in enterprise, it's people who are doing very complex content creation on it, and who are actually using it as a video editing suite. Now, I know that people do that, but that's such a tiny subsection of the market. This is the latest iPad Air. Okay, it hasn't got a high refresh rate screen, it doesn't have Face ID, but it is super, super powerful. I can never max this out. I would not know how to. And it's much cheaper than the new iPad Pro. It doesn't have an M1 chip in it. And I know there's an unbelievable amount of headroom in this thing that I'll just never experience. So why add an M1 chip to an iPad? Apple are on a bit of a high at the moment, and I completely get that. They've completely nailed this M1 chip. It's been such a rocket ship they've kind of thrown into the industry, and it's got other manufacturers scared. You know, we've seen Intel with their ridiculous Justin Long adverts. They don't know what to do. And Apple, okay, they do have complete control of their ecosystem, they have control of the hardware and the software, but that's the point. It's giving them this leg up which other manufacturers just can't get to. The M1 has changed the way I think about computing. I've waxed lyrical about it on this channel. The Mac Mini, which is sitting in front of me now, is now my workhorse. It replaced a computer that was 3 times its price. M1 MacBook Air, fantastic. I love the look of the new iMac. I think it's a very sensible entry point for that particular device into the M1 ecosystem. I'll do a video about that very soon. But this new iPad Pro, putting the M1 into that, it feels like the result of a drunken all-nighter at Apple HQ. You know, check us out, we've just completely wiped the floor with the M1, with Intel. Shall we put it in an iPad? Yeah, why not? Part of me hopes that did actually happen. I love the idea of them actually just deciding to lob an M1 into an iPad after a drunken night out, but I don't think it was. What bothers me is what is going to follow, and what has already followed to a degree, from some of the slightly partisan Apple tech crowd who will be reporting on how amazing this thing is. And the worry with that is that people are going to rush out and buy this iPad Pro and spend a lot of money on it when they could probably get away with an iPad Air and save a huge amount of money. And like me, they might get the iPad Pro, get the keyboard case, start using it as a kind of laptop, knowing they've got this fantastic chip in it. And after a few months, they might start thinking, should I have bought the M1 MacBook Air? Or maybe I should perhaps have just bought the normal iPad Air. Don't get me wrong, I love the iPad. I just think comparing the Pro version of it to the Pro Display XDR, a £6,000 reference monitor, I think it's a little bit tone deaf. I just don't really think that Apple has read the room correctly with this one. Another explanation is that they perhaps can't take the iPad much further, and they know that. They're perhaps a little bit stuck to know what to do with it, which would explain why iPadOS is so slow to kind of get anywhere. But obviously they know that it needs a regular release cycle, so why not put your M1 chip in there as well? And one of the other benefits of that is a single supply chain for a CPU rather than lots of different supply chains for different devices. So I can see that from a manufacturing, logistics, profitability point of view, it probably makes sense. But I just can't get excited about this M1 chip in the iPad. There were some other tech flexes, if you can call them that, in this event for the iPad Pro, which annoyed me. 5G. Now, if you can get 5G where you are and you're using it reliably wherever you go, please let me know in the comments. But I live in England, and where I live, which is in Warwickshire, we should have, apparently, if you look at all the maps of 4G coverage, pretty good 4G coverage. The reality of that isn't always the case. My iPhone 12 Pro regularly slips down to 1 bar and struggles to get a signal sometimes, and that's in a fairly busy town, well covered apparently. 5G is something which is coming. It's going to be here at some stage for most of us, but it's so far in the distance, and it does annoy me when Apple makes such a big fuss about it. There's also a new camera system on the iPad Pro. Understandably, they've paid the most attention to that front-facing camera. Obviously more people now than ever are doing Zoom calls and Teams calls and FaceTimes, etc. And and you need a decent front-facing camera, so they've put this 12 megapixel ultra-wide lens on the front of the iPad. Now that's a really good idea, and it also does this thing where if you're moving about, it will follow you. And if someone else comes into the frame, it will actually zoom out, zoom in. Really cool, actually. Teams does this. It doesn't zoom out and zoom in, but it does do the kind of thing like that. So they're not first to post with this, but it's a nice addition. I didn't mind that. And lastly, there was no meaningful update to the Magic Keyboard case. A lot of people thought they were going to put a little slot in for the Apple Pencil, but nothing happened really apart from painting it white. And it does look very cool in white, but it's still that same pretty expensive keyboard cover, which I do like, but it adds lots of bulk to the device. It adds lots of cost to the iPad as well. But if you were expecting a brand new keyboard case with function keys and whatever else it was that you wanted, you're going to be a bit disappointed. But on the subject of that case, just very quickly coming back to that trackpad support, in terms of evolution of the iPad, that is the one thing in the last 2, 3, 4 years that has really changed my opinion of it. And before I got the M1 MacBook Air, I was using an iPad Pro out on the road as my kind of daily driver when I'm in coffee shops and working at the gym and all that sort of stuff. But like I say, I then got the M1 MacBook Air, and that kind of relegated my iPad Pro to being this thing in front of me which I use just to read my notes for the videos. But trackpad support, that made the iPad Pro more of a productivity tool for me, and I think quite a lot of other people. So in conclusion, I received a lot of stick for my assessment of the Apple TV, not the one that's just been launched, the one before that, where I said it should be cancelled. I wrote an article about that on Medium. Most people, to be honest, did not agree with me. But my beef with the new iPad Pro feels a bit different. It's a technical marvel, do not get me wrong. What they've done with it by putting that M1 in there, it's so far into the stratosphere, it's untrue. But it's a bit like putting 10-bit Dolby Vision HDR recording in your iPhone. That is technically mind-boggling, but pointless, because you've got to turn it on for starters. Have you used it? Have you got an iPhone 12 Pro? Have you ever turned that on? I haven't. And the biggest problem with the new iPad Pro is this, the iPad Air. It's the one iPad I will always recommend unless you want a bigger screen. That's the only reason in my mind to get that big iPad 12 Pro. I think until iPadOS catches up, and I'm filming this before WWDC in June, how long will it take for iPadOS and third-party apps to actually make use of that M1 chip? And when they do, what's it going to mean for users like you and I? And lastly, what is wrong with the iPad just being a consumption device? They do the best possible job for that. I don't want anything more from them. I need really convincing that that M1 chip would give me functionality from an iPad that I need. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? Get involved in the comments. And if you want to see what I thought about the rest of the spring-loaded event, keep watching for a link to that video. But in the meantime, thank you as always for watching, and I'll catch you on the next video.